We started off our Polaris refresh coverage with the RX 580 review, which you can find on the website and channel already. That coverage focused on the 1060 and 580, and today we're focusing on the RX 470, 570 with a splash of the 1060 and 1050 Ti. This review highlights the Gigabyte RX 570 Aorus card, which uses a dual fan cooler medium form factor and the new Polaris updates to BIOS. Before that, this coverage is brought to you by the Computex Conference, which runs from May 30th to June 3rd in Taipei, Taiwan this year. Computex is the biggest event of the year for PC hardware and technology, where we preview the newest prototypes before they come to market. We highly recommend attending or following this event online for industry professionals and enthusiasts. Learn more at the link in the description below. Other than BIOS updates that improve idle and relaxed workload power consumption on the 500 series cards like these and this one, the Gigabyte one for today, the other update is increased frequency stock and increased voltage headroom allowed by AMD, though the vendors have to actually implement that on their devices. And that allows for higher performance overall, though marginal in some cases, like you'll see here today. The increased frequency is a way to get some extra performance out of what's left of Polaris prior to launching AMD's next major line. The Gigabyte RX 570 Aorus card is priced at $180 right now, landing it between the 1060, the 580, and the 1050 Ti cards, and those are respectively at around $240 to $250 and around $140 to $165 at the high end for the 1050 Ti. Gigabyte is shipping its RX 570 Aorus with clocks at 1295 MHz in OC mode or 1280 in gaming mode, and the rest of the specs are exactly the same as the RX 470. It's only an updated power profile, updated BIOS, and updated frequencies, and technically you can unlock 400 series cards into 500 series cards with a BIOS flash. We started retesting all the cards on our bench for the 1080 Ti review, so that means the low-end cards are still being retested. We've retested the 470, of course the 570, 580s, 480s have been redone, the 1060s have been redone, and the 1050 Ti has been redone. We still have to work on a few other ones like the 1063 GB and 484 GB, but the delta between the 3 and 6 model and the 4 and 8 model of the 1060 and 480 respectively should be the same today as it was originally, and we have content on that if you're curious for more. Before getting started on this, just like the 580 review, this isn't a new architecture, so there's not a whole lot of new stuff to talk about. It is the same Polaris, just with a few small updates. UARC is the same. So this review will be focused entirely on performance. That's going to be in power first, then thermals, and then gaming performance with overclocks included. And other than that, if you are curious about the architecture of Polaris, you can check our original RX 480 review, which has all of that defined, and it has not changed for the 580 and the 570 cards. Methodology, as always, is linked in the description below on probably page 1 or 2 of the article. The full article down there will include 3D Mark tests, which this video won't have, and a couple of 1440p tests, but otherwise everything is here. Power draw is measured at the wall. This isn't a perfect way to measure power consumption. You'd ideally do it at the rails, but since we're looking at total system power with only the GPU swapped, we're ultimately studying deltas between components, and that's enough to figure out where they land. With 3D Mark Firestrike Extreme workloads, the Gigabyte RX 570 Aorus system draws 260 watts from the wall, and that's about 4.8% more than the RX 480 Gaming X from MSI, or about 26% more than the RX 470 Platinum card, and about 28.7% more than the GTX 1060 SSC. The RX 580 Gaming X system, meanwhile, draws about 8% more power than the RX 570 system. And looking at a few games next, For Honor posts the RX 570 system at 290 watts from the wall, which is an increase of 5% over the RX 480 Gaming X. And it's also an increase of about 28% over the RX 470 Platinum, and an increase of about 33% over the 1060 SSC. The RX 580 at 310 watts from the wall is drawing 6.8% more power than the RX 570. We see more of the same in Ghost Recon with the RX 570 at 279 watts from the wall, or about 7.7% more than the RX 480, 27% more than the RX 470, and 32% more than the GTX 1060 SSC 6GB. Finally, idle power draw has the 570 at 75 watts total system power, which is an improvement over the 400 series and the RX 470, for example, which runs at 79 watts in the same configuration, resulting in a power reduction of 5% in the 500 series over the 400 series when idle. We saw similar with the RX 580, and this is expected. AMD has tuned the BIOS power profile and voltages so that the RX 500 series draws less power when idle or when in multi-monitor and movie viewing scenarios, though the 500 series clearly draws quite a bit more power than the 400 series when in loaded scenarios, because it's running those higher frequencies and voltages out of the box. Thermals go hand in hand in power as the two are directly correlated. Starting with frequency versus temperature, time, and fan speed, we see that the RX 570 Aorus GPU runs its temperature against a line of about 76 degrees Celsius, with an ever-increasing fan RPM that seems to max out around 2300 to keep temperatures to 76°C under a torture scenario. Clock fluctuations are largely unnoticeable, with a line that's nearly flat for the entire duration of the test. Although the fan increases to sustain this clock rate, the user experience, noise notwithstanding, is better as a result. We don't experience noticeable clock range swings, and those could introduce stuttering from frequency changes if they were to occur. Looking at temperatures of the individual components, we see that the Gigabyte board continues its trend of running a little warmer than its competition from MSI and EVGA, but it's not in a way that impacts performance aside from potential inefficiency and power consumption. We're looking at temperatures on the VRAM of about 80 to 84°C with the hottest module, with FET temperatures of the relatively densely packed VRM left of the GPU at around 80 Celsius. Adding the MSI RX 580 Gaming X to the charts for perspective, this is represented, by the way, by various shades of red on the chart, we see MSI's VRM, VRAM, and GPU components all hover around 68 to 71°C. There are different components at play. Of course, the FETs aren't exactly the same, the cooling design is different. That means we've got a few variables, and we're not anywhere close to the 125°C threshold for most FETs, so performance is fine, it's better with MSI and the twin Frozer cooler. This is particularly true for the VRAM, where Gigabyte and the 570 Aorus use a less impressive cooling solution for the memory flanking the GPU. Here's a resurrection of our EQ thermals chart, which shows the GPU temperature to simplify things. There's more than a year of data on this chart, as you can see here, so we're going to crop it in a bit to just the most relevant parts for today. The Gigabyte RX 570 Aorus in this cropped chart lands at around 46.4 Celsius delta T over ambient for load, or about 4.3 Celsius idle. This is warmer than the MSI RX 580 Gaming X at 41.7 Celsius delta T, which is running a more aggressive fan profile in these tests. The Sapphire RX 470 with reference blower cooler runs at around 50.3 Celsius delta T, and that provides perspective on one of the worst coolers that exists for the RX series of cards. The Aorus card certainly isn't impressive in the thermals department, but it's also $180. Time to move on to the game benchmarks. Most of these will be at 1080p, though we did run several of the tests at 1440p. You'll find most of those charts in the article below. We're focusing on 1080p for the video today. Before getting into the tests, let's look at the OC stepping table. We ended up with a stable 1400 MHz clock for some initial burn-in, but we had to drop it to 1390 to sustain a stable clock for most of the games tested. Doom was a special case where we had to drop clocks all the way down to about 1350 to 1360 MHz to keep stable because it would just crash on the menu otherwise. Other games were run at 1390. Mass Effect Andromeda currently has the most cards on the chart. The Gigabyte RX 570 Aorus 4GB card lands at 62 FPS average, 50 FPS 1% lows, and 47 FPS 0.1% lows. These frame times are tightly packed and consistent, making for a smooth experience overall, and that can be said for nearly all the cards tested with this particular game. That lands the RX 570 at about 780 Ti reference card levels, and effectively tied with the RX 470 Sapphire card. The 1050 Ti, for comparison, is blown away in price to performance by the 570 and 470, assuming a $180 price tag on the Aorus 570. The 1050 Ti runs about 19% slower than that 570, while the 570 runs about 20% slower than the 580 Gaming X, or about 28.6% slower than the GTX 1060 SSC. Overclocking the RX 570 gets us an improvement of about 4.3% over the stock card. Considering that we're off to effectively equal performance to an RX 470 in this particular game, the 570 isn't impressive given the relative power draw increase of 25 to 28%, and we can now look to another title where there's more room for improvement. Looking now at For Honor, the RX 570 Aorus card runs at around 77 FPS average, placing it roughly 3.5% ahead of the RX 470 4GB card, and about 35% ahead of the $140 GTX 1050 Ti. In other words, the 1050 Ti is still oddly positioned, just as it has been since our initial review, and doesn't necessarily get a recommendation in most cases. We were able to get an actually stable overclock on the Aorus 570 for once with this game, but had to drop our max stable OC by about 10 MHz to stop obliterating the frame time variance numbers. Overclocking landed us at about 6% ahead of the stock 570, with only a slight performance detriment to 1% and 0.1% low values after fine tuning. The RX 580 Gaming X is the next card on the charts, running 93 FPS average for an improvement of about 20% over the RX 570, with a GTX 1060 SSC at 94 FPS average. That's about $60 to $70 difference for about a 20% performance improvement with either the 580 or the 1060. For what it's worth, the overclocked 570 is performing only a few FPS behind the stock RX 480 Gaming X, just under 5% total behind that card. We're now referencing AMD's best case scenario, using Doom with the Vulkan API and asynchronous compute support. The RX 570 Aorus card runs Doom well at 1080p, pushing about 120 FPS average, marking it ahead of the RX 470 by 5.4% in average frame rate, in exchange for a power draw increase of around 25%. The 570 is also ahead of the 1050 Ti by about 67%. And overclocking the 570 doesn't really do much for us here, only moving frame rate bars by about 2 FPS to the right, and equating a performance roughly equal to that of the GTX 1060 SSC levels pre-overclock. The RX 580, for comparison, runs at around 140 FPS average pre-OC, making it 16.8% faster than the 570 stock card. Doom can be run at 1440p just as easily with all of these cards, so we can look at those numbers now briefly. The RX 570 Aorus runs at around 79 FPS pre-overclock, ahead of the RX 470 by about 7 FPS or 9%. The RX 570 is close to the 1060 SSC in performance here and is about 20 FPS behind the RX 580 Gaming X. Ghost Recon Wildlands at 1080p with very high settings gets a little hard for the RX 570 and 470 to run, but we also ran tests at medium as part of a new low-end test suite. The 570 Aorus card runs around 51 FPS average here, with overclocking benefiting our average frame rate by about 7.8%. This lands the stock Aorus reasonably ahead of the 1050 Ti, and about 2 FPS ahead of the 470, or 3.4%. That's not a great trade for the power increase, but it is an improvement. The RX 580 Gaming X, meanwhile, is about 13.7% faster than the RX 570 Aorus card, with the 1060 SSC about 31% faster than the stock 570 Aorus card. Looking at our new chart, this one only has a few cards on it because we just started building this data for the 570 review. We've got medium settings at 1080p here, with the Gigabyte RX 570 now running over 60 FPS, placing about 65 FPS average pre-overclock or about 68 FPS post-overclock, resulting in an improvement of about 5.6%. The stock 570 outperforms the stock 470 by about 4.4% and outperforms the 1050 Ti by about 22%. Sniper Elite is our last game for the charts in the video, though you can find 3D Mark and Ashes of the Singularity in the article linked below. Just like Ghost Recon, we've had to expand our Sniper Elite test to include 1080p resolutions. We were originally only benchmarking Sniper at 4K for the 1080 Ti launch, but we've just begun building 1080p results. We're starting with the 4K results because the chart is the most built up and gives some idea of deltas, and next we'll do 1080p. The RX 570 runs this particular bench at around 35 FPS average stock, or about 37 with the overclock, and that puts it around the same levels of performance as the 1060 SSC pre-OC, which was previously outmatched somewhat handily by the RX 580 Gaming X, operating at around 40 FPS average, though with a higher power draw as a trade. At 1080p high, the RX 570 is sustaining around 100 FPS average, putting it ahead of the RX 470 Platinum by about 9.3%, and that's the biggest lead of all the games tested. So that's it for the 570. The Aorus card at $180 is priced correctly. That's where it should be. This one's a bit warm, but we haven't tested other 570s yet to compare. But at $180, it's around the right price. The stack here doesn't really change in terms of recommendations. Previously, we were recommending a 1050 over a 460 because there was a pretty reasonable performance gain. And we were recommending a 470 over a 1050 Ti if you could afford the extra $30 or so. It was well worth it in most cases. That remains true here. The 570 is slightly better than the 470 and therefore still just as much better than the 1050 Ti as the 470 was previously, though with a couple extra percent on top of it. So we're still recommending about a 1050 over a 460, and we're recommending a 470 or 570 over the 1050 Ti, though some of the lower end 1050 Ti's, like the $140 one we used here, could be instituted in some of the weird priced builds where you might have something really specific you're doing. It's not a bad card, it's just kind of between two good cards on either end. And then for the higher end stuff, if you're looking for something around the $250 mark, 1060 and the 480 or 580 are still good for that. Look at that coverage to figure out which one you like more. That's mostly a power versus performance argument between the two. But for the 570, the only thing here that's really a little different is that the performance gain over the 470, at least with this specific 570, is not a whole lot. It tends to be maybe something like 5 or 6% in some of the medium cases, I think the one game we hit the most was Sniper, but a lot of the games were either basically equal or just slightly ahead with the 570, and the power draw increases is somewhat substantial other than idle workloads or low power movie viewing type tasks. So if you've already got a 400 series card, as stated previously, the 500 series is not for you. It's not built for you. If you don't have a card that's been made in the last couple years, then the 500 series and the 10 series are still worth looking at. Just the 570 is not that much better than a 470. So if you can find a 470 for a decent amount less than this, because it's used or whatever, it might be worth the buy, especially if you're really concerned about power. Because if you're concerned about power, the 470 draws less and performs really not that much worse. It's a couple percent for something like 25% power. So that's all for this one. The article is linked below if you need more information. As always, you can subscribe for more. You can go to patreon.com/gamersnexus to help us out directly with this testing. Or you can go to store.gamersnexus.net if you'd like to buy a shirt like this one, which has our average 1% and 0.1% low bars on it. Thank you for watching. As always, I'll see you all next time.